You think motivation is the engine. That's your first mistake. Motivation is for people who don't have control over their own mind. It's a cheap emotional spike, a temporary high like sugar for weak men. You wait to feel like working, to feel like improving, to feel like becoming dangerous, and that's exactly why you stay average. The moment you stop chasing motivation, everything changes. Not gradually, not softly, brutally. Because now there's no excuse left, no emotional crutch, just you, and the truth about who you really are. You've been trained to believe that you need inspiration to act. That's a lie sold to keep you passive. Powerful men don't wait for motivation. They operate on command. They move because they said they would move. And when you cut off that dependency, when you stop asking yourself, do I feel like it? You enter a different level of existence. Cold, precise, relentless. That's where real progress begins. Not in excitement, but in obedience to your own standards. And this is where most people break. Because without motivation, you're left with silence. No hype, no emotional noise, just your thoughts. That's when the real language starts, the one weak men don't understand. I call it speaking in tongues, not some mystical nonsense. I'm talking about the internal dialogue of a man who has taken control of his own mind. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop begging for comfort. Your thoughts become commands. Direct, ruthless, efficient. Do it. And you do it. No debate, no delay. When you reach this state, your identity shifts. You're no longer the guy trying to be disciplined. You are disciplined. That's a completely different level. Most people play with discipline like it's a tool they pick up and drop whenever they feel like it. You become the embodiment of it. It's in how you walk, how you think, how you react. You don't need external validation. You don't need motivation videos. Your internal voice is enough, and it doesn't whisper. It orders. Understand this clearly. When you stop seeking motivation, you lose your comfort, but you gain power. Real power. The kind that doesn't fluctuate based on mood. The kind that doesn't disappear when life gets hard. You become predictable to yourself. Reliable. Dangerous. And that's rare, because most men are emotional creatures pretending to be logical. You become the opposite, a controlled force that executes regardless of circumstance. And here's the part you won't like. You'll feel empty at first. That's the cost. No emotional highs. No fake excitement. Just work. Reps. Silence. But inside that silence, something builds. A quiet confidence. Not loud, not flashy, but unbreakable. Because it's built on action, not feelings. That's when you realize motivation was never helping you. It was holding you back. Motivation is the lie you keep telling yourself to avoid facing your lack of control. You've been conditioned to believe that you need to feel right before you act, that some internal spark has to ignite before you move. That belief alone is enough to keep you stuck for years, because now your entire life is dictated by a feeling you don't control. Some days you have it, most days you don't, and on those days, nothing gets done. That's not discipline, that's dependency. Look at your patterns honestly. The days you feel motivated, you suddenly become productive, focused, even confident. You tell yourself, this is the new me. Then the next day, the feeling disappears. And so do your standards. Your energy drops, your focus collapses, and you go right back to your old habits. That cycle repeats over and over until years pass and nothing meaningful changes. Not because you lack potential, but because you're addicted to the wrong trigger. You're waiting for emotion to lead, instead of forcing action to dominate. High-level performers don't operate like that. They don't ask themselves if they feel like working, training, or improving. That question doesn't exist in their system. They've removed it completely because they understand something you don't yet. Feelings are unstable, unreliable, and easily manipulated. If your output depends on them, your results will always be inconsistent. And inconsistent men don't win in any serious arena. You say you want success, power, control, but your behavior says something else. It says you want comfort first, you want certainty. You want that emotional push that makes things feel easy. That's not how this works. The real shift happens when you accept that most of the time you won't feel like doing what needs to be done. And you do it anyway. Not because you're inspired, but because you decided that your word means something. That when you say you act regardless of mood, energy, or circumstances. This is where the separation begins. Most men live in reaction. They wake up and immediately scan their emotions, trying to figure out what kind of day they're allowed to have. If they feel good, they move. If they don't, they stall. You cannot build anything powerful like that. That's not control, that's surrender disguised as self-awareness. You've handed authority over your life to something as fragile as a passing feeling. When you remove motivation from the equation, everything becomes brutally clear. There's no waiting, no delay, no emotional negotiation. There's only the standard you've set and whether or not you meet it. It simplifies your entire existence. Either you execute or you don't. And if you don't, there's no excuse left to hide behind. That level of clarity is uncomfortable, but it's necessary because it forces you to confront the truth about your habits, your discipline, and your identity. The moment you stop relying on motivation, your actions start becoming predictable. You show up whether you feel like it or not. You train when you're tired, you work when you're bored, you push forward when everything in your mind is telling you to stop. That's not normal behavior. And that's exactly the point. Normal behavior produces average results. If you want something beyond average, your standards have to operate beyond average logic. You don't need another burst of inspiration. You need control over your own commands. The ability to act without emotional permission is what separates those who talk from those who build. Because in the end, the man who moves without needing motivation is the man who can't be stopped by anything internal. And that makes him a problem for everything external. You keep treating discipline like it's a tool you can pick up when it's convenient and drop the second it gets uncomfortable. That's the fundamental flaw. As long as discipline is something you use, it will always be optional. And anything optional will eventually be ignored the moment pressure shows up. You don't rise by occasionally being disciplined. You rise when discipline becomes non-negotiable, when it's no longer an action you perform, but a standard you live by. Watch how most people approach it. They say, "I'll be disciplined today." That sentence alone exposes the weakness. It means tomorrow is uncertain. It means discipline is tied to mood, circumstances, or temporary motivation. That's not power, that's instability. Because the moment something disrupts their routine, everything collapses. One bad day turns into 3, then a week, then they're right back where they started, pretending they just need to get back on track. There was never a track. There was only a fragile system built on convenience. Discipline at a high level doesn't operate like that. It's not something you turn on and off. It's embedded in your identity. It dictates how you think before you even act. You don't wake up and decide whether you'll follow through. You already know you will. There's no internal debate, no emotional hesitation. The decision was made long before the moment arrived. That's the difference between a man who practices discipline and a man who embodies it. When discipline becomes your identity, your behavior changes automatically. You don't skip workouts because you're not feeling it. That excuse doesn't exist anymore. You don't procrastinate because the task is boring or difficult. That logic doesn't apply to you. Your standards override your preferences. And that's where control is built. When what you want becomes irrelevant compared to what you do. Most people never reach this level because they're too attached to comfort, too protective of their emotions, too unwilling to enforce rules on themselves. Understand this clearly. Identity is the strongest force driving human behavior. You will always act in alignment with who you believe you are. If you see yourself as someone who tries to be disciplined, your actions will always be inconsistent. But if you see yourself as a disciplined man, your actions follow that identity without resistance. There's no friction, no struggle, no need for motivation. It's simply how you operate. That shift doesn't happen by thinking differently. It happens by enforcing behavior until it becomes automatic. You don't wait to feel like a disciplined person. You act like one repeatedly until there's no other version of you left. That means doing the work when it's inconvenient, when it's uncomfortable, when there's no reward in sight. It means holding the line when no one is watching, when there's zero external pressure forcing you to perform. That's where identity is forged, not in public wins, but in private consistency. Most people underestimate how brutal this process is. They want quick transformation, immediate results, visible progress. But identity doesn't shift that way. It's built to repetition under resistance. Every time you follow through, despite not wanting to, you reinforce that identity. Every time you break your word, you weaken it. There's no middle ground. You're either strengthening the standard or destroying it. When discipline becomes who you are, your life stops being chaotic. There's structure, there's order, there's predictability in your actions, regardless of external conditions. You don't need reminders, accountability partners, or motivational speeches. Those are substitutes for people who haven't built internal authority yet. You become self-governing. And that's rare because most men would rather rely on external systems than take full responsibility for their own behavior. You say you want control, but control doesn't come from occasional effort. It comes from absolute alignment between your identity and your actions. The moment discipline stops being something you do and becomes something you are, everything shifts. Your standards rise. Your tolerance for weakness drops. Your execution sharpens. And the gap between you and the average man becomes impossible to ignore. Every time you ask yourself, should I do this now? You've already created a gap where weakness can enter. That single question sounds harmless, even responsible. But it's the exact moment control slips. Because now you've opened the door for negotiation. You've given your lower instincts a seat at the table. And they will always argue for comfort, delay, and avoidance. That's their job. If you allow that conversation to happen, don't be surprised when you lose it. Pay attention to how your mind operates under pressure. When something difficult appears, your thoughts don't immediately say, execute. They start offering alternatives, maybe later. You deserve a break. You're not in the right state right now. It sounds logical. It feels justified. But it's all the same pattern soft language designed to weaken your response. That's not intelligence. That's your mind protecting you from discomfort at the cost of progress. High-level control begins when that internal language changes completely. You stop asking questions and start issuing commands. Direct, simple, non-negotiable instructions. Do it now. Finish it. Move. There's no emotion attached. No explanation required. You don't need to convince yourself. You don't need to build momentum. You don't need the perfect conditions. You give the order and your body follows. That level of clarity removes friction. It eliminates delay. It turns action into a default, not a decision. Most people resist this because it feels harsh. It feels rigid. They think they're being too strict on themselves. That's exactly the problem. They're too comfortable entertaining weakness. They built a habit of listening to every passing thought as if it deserves equal authority. It doesn't. Not every thought is valid. Not every impulse should be respected. If you treat all internal dialogue as equal, you'll end up following the weakest voice more often than the strongest. Authority over your own mind requires hierarchy. There has to be a dominant voice, the one that sets direction and enforces it. Everything else gets ignored. That's what discipline looks like at a cognitive level. You don't eliminate thoughts. You control which ones get to influence your actions. And the ones that question effort, delay execution, or seek comfort get shut down immediately. Not debated, not analyzed, dismissed. This is where most men fail without realizing it. They think their problem is lack of time, lack of energy, or lack of opportunity. In reality, it's lack of command. They haven't trained themselves to respond instantly to their own instructions. So every task becomes a negotiation. Every decision becomes a mental battle. That constant friction drains energy faster than the work itself. You're not tired because you're doing too much. You're tired because you're hesitating too often. When you eliminate negotiation, your efficiency changes overnight. You stop wasting time thinking about doing things and start doing them immediately. That creates momentum, and momentum creates confidence. Not the fake kind built on positive thinking, but the real kind built on evidence. You trust yourself because you've proven that when you give an order, it gets executed. That trust becomes one of your strongest assets. There's also a deeper shift happening. You begin to separate identity from emotion. You realize that how you feel in the moment has no authority over what you do. You can be tired and still perform. You can be unmotivated and still execute. You can be distracted and still focus because the command overrides the state. That's control. That's power. And it's completely unavailable to anyone who keeps asking themselves for permission. The difference between average and elite isn't intelligence, talent, or luck. It's speed of execution. And speed comes from clarity. When your mind speaks in commands, there's no delay between decision and action. That gap disappears. And in that gap is where most people lose their edge, their consistency, and eventually their results. You don't need more ideas. You need fewer questions and stronger orders. You call it consistency, but what you're really practicing is convenience disguised as effort. You show up when it feels right, when your energy is high, when your mood aligns, and then you convince yourself you're building discipline. You're not. You're building a fragile pattern that collapses the second pressure enters the equation. Consistency that depends on how you feel isn't consistency at all. It's a temporary streak waiting to break. Look at your behavior without filtering it through excuses. On your best days, you perform well, you focus, you execute, you move forward, but those days are selective. They rely on internal conditions you don't control. The moment stress hits, or boredom creeps in, or you're simply not in the mood, everything slows down or stops completely. That inconsistency is the reason your results never compound. You're constantly resetting instead of building. Real consistency operates under a completely different principle. It's not tied to emotion, energy, or external circumstances. It's tied to standards, fixed, non-negotiable rules that define your behavior regardless of how you feel. When standards are in place, the question is no longer, do I feel like doing this? It becomes, is this required? And if the answer is yes, it gets done. No delay, no adjustment, no exceptions. Most people avoid setting real standards because standards remove flexibility. They force accountability. Once you define a standard, you can't hide behind excuses anymore. If you're broke, if you're lost, if your life's speed, if your life's mediocrity. It's uncomfortable, so people dilute their standards into vague intentions. I'll try. I'll do my best. Those phrases sound harmless, but they create loopholes, and your mind will exploit every loophole available. Standards eliminate those loopholes. They create structure where there used to be uncertainty. You don't rely on motivation to start, and you don't rely on willpower to continue. The system runs because it's been defined in advance. You've already decided what happens, when it happens, and how it happens. That removes the need for constant decision-making, which is where most people lose consistency. They burn energy thinking instead of executing. There's also a psychological shift that happens when you operate on standards. You stop identifying with your temporary state and start identifying with your long-term behavior. It doesn't matter if you're tired, distracted, or uninspired, the standard still applies. That separation is critical, because if your identity is tied to your current feelings, your actions will always fluctuate. But if your identity is tied to your standards, your actions remain stable even when your internal state is unstable. Pressure is the real test. Anyone can look consistent when things are easy. When life is smooth, when time is available, when energy is high, it's simple to perform. But those conditions don't last. Real life introduces chaos, fatigue, and unpredictability. That's where mood-based consistency breaks instantly. You start skipping, delaying, adjusting, and suddenly the system is gone. Standards, on the other hand, don't change under pressure. They exist specifically to carry you through it. This is why high performers look almost mechanical in their execution. It's not because they're superhuman, it's because they've removed variability from their behavior. They've trained themselves to act the same way, regardless of conditions. That reliability is what allows progress to stack over time. Small actions repeated without interruption create momentum that compounds into serious results. Most people never experience that because they interrupt their own progress too often. You're not lacking effort, you're lacking structure. You're not inconsistent because you're lazy. You're inconsistent because your system is weak. Fixing that doesn't require more motivation. It requires stricter standards and the willingness to follow them even when it's inconvenient. Because the moment your behavior becomes dependent on mood, you've handed control over to something unstable. And anything unstable will eventually fail you. You keep chasing comfort like it's a reward, when in reality it's the very thing keeping you stuck. Every decision you make is quietly filtered through one question. Will this feel easy? And if the answer is no, you hesitate, delay, or avoid it entirely. That pattern feels natural, even logical, but it's the exact mechanism that guarantees you stay average. Because anything that actually changes your life sits on the other side of discomfort. Pay attention to what comfort really does. It slows you down. It softens your standards. It convinces you that you have time, that you can start later, that missing one day doesn't matter. It wraps weakness in reasonable language so you don't feel guilty about underperforming. And the more you listen to it, the stronger it gets. What starts as small compromises turns into a lifestyle where effort feels optional and discipline feels extreme. Now look at the moments when you've actually grown. Not when things were easy, not when everything aligned, but when you were forced into situations that demanded more from you than you were used to getting. When you were uncomfortable, uncertain, even slightly overwhelmed, that's where adaptation happens. That's where your mind expands, your tolerance increases, and your capability rises. Growth doesn't exist inside comfort. It requires friction. The problem is, most people interpret discomfort as a signal to stop. They feel resistance and assume something is wrong. They back off, adjust, or quit entirely. But that interpretation is backwards. Discomfort is not a warning. It's an indicator. It's telling you that you've reached the edge of your current capacity. And that edge is exactly where progress begins. If you keep stepping back every time you feel it, you'll never move beyond your current limits. When you stop seeking motivation, you're forced to confront discomfort directly. There's no emotional boost to mask it, no temporary excitement to make things feel easier. It's just you and the work. And that's where most people realize they built their entire approach around avoiding difficulty. Without motivation to carry them, they're exposed. Every weakness becomes visible. Every excuse loses its power. It's uncomfortable, but it's honest. This is where control is developed. Not by eliminating discomfort, but by learning to operate within it. You don't wait for it to pass. You don't try to make everything easier. You adjust your response. You train yourself to act despite the resistance, to move forward even when it feels heavy, repetitive, or mentally draining. That ability changes everything, because now your performance is no longer tied to favorable conditions. There's also a deeper advantage most people miss. When you consistently operate in discomfort, your perception of difficulty changes. What once felt hard becomes normal. What once required effort becomes automatic. That shift increases your baseline. Tasks that overwhelm others become manageable for you. Situations that cause hesitation in others don't even register as obstacles. You're not necessarily doing less difficult things. You've just expanded your capacity to handle them. Comfort, on the other hand, does the opposite. It shrinks your tolerance. It lowers your threshold for effort. It makes simple tasks feel demanding and minor challenges feel overwhelming. The more you indulge in it, the weaker your response becomes. That's why people who constantly seek comfort struggle with consistency. They train themselves to avoid anything that requires sustained effort. Breaking this cycle requires a deliberate shift. You have to stop viewing discomfort as something negative and start recognizing it as a necessary component of progress. Not something to be endured occasionally, but something to be integrated into your routine. It becomes part of the process, not an exception to it. You expect it, you accept it, and eventually you operate through it without hesitation. The moment you stop chasing comfort, your decision-making becomes sharper. You're no longer asking what feels good. You're asking what moves you forward. That single shift removes a massive amount of distraction. It simplifies your choices and aligns your actions with your goals. Because in the end, comfort and growth don't coexist. You either protect one or you pursue the other. You keep waiting for inspiration like it's a signal that you're ready. You tell yourself that once you feel driven, focused, locked in, then you'll act. That's the trap. Because inspiration is inconsistent, unpredictable, and completely outside your control. Building your life around it is like building on unstable ground. Some days it holds, most days it collapses. And every time it disappears, so does your progress. Look at how that plays out in real terms. When inspiration hits, you feel unstoppable. You set goals, you make plans, you even start executing with intensity. It feels real in the moment, like something has finally clicked. But that state doesn't last. It fades quickly, and when it does, you're left with the same decisions, the same work, the same resistance, but now without the emotional push that made it feel easy. That's where most people stop. Not because they can't continue, but because they've conditioned themselves to rely on that initial spark. The problem isn't that inspiration exists. The problem is that you've made it a requirement. You trained your mind to believe that action should feel driven, energized, even exciting. So when it doesn't, you interpret that as a sign to slow down or wait. That interpretation is costing you more than you realize. Because every delay reinforces the idea that your actions depend on your feelings, and that keeps you locked in a cycle of inconsistency. Real progress starts when you flip that relationship. Action doesn't follow inspiration. Inspiration follows action. When you move first without waiting, without overthinking, you create momentum. That momentum builds clarity. And that clarity builds confidence, not because you felt ready, but because you proved to yourself that readiness isn't required. You acted anyway, and the result came after. That's how control is established. This is where refusal becomes a critical factor. You refuse to disobey your own instructions. You refuse to delay tasks you already decided on. You refuse to let temporary emotions override long-term objectives. That level of refusal creates a standard that's difficult to break. Because once you internalize that your word is final, hesitation loses its power. There's no space left for excuses. You either follow through or you expose a gap between what you say and what you do. Most people live with that gap constantly. They set intentions they don't honor, make promises they don't keep, And over time, they lose trust in themselves. That lack of trust is subtle but destructive. It lowers their expectations, weakens their decisions, and makes them second-guess even simple actions. They don't realize it, but they've trained themselves to ignore their own voice. And once that happens, external motivation becomes the only thing that pushes them forward. Closing that gap changes everything. When you consistently act on your own commands, you rebuild internal trust. You know that if you say something will get done, it gets done. That certainty removes doubt. It sharpens your focus. It increases your efficiency because you're no longer wasting time debating or delaying. Your actions become direct and immediate. There's also a level of independence that comes with this. You don't need external triggers to start moving. You don't rely on environment, mood, or timing. You operate on your own system. That makes you adaptable. Whether conditions are ideal or not, your output remains steady. And that stability is what allows progress to compound over time. Understand the difference clearly. Inspiration is emotional and temporary. Refusal is deliberate and consistent. One depends on how you feel. The other depends on what you've decided. If your life's built on inspiration, your results will always fluctuate. If it's built on refusal, on the simple principle that you don't break your own rules, your results become predictable. The men who move forward aren't the ones who feel the most inspired. They're the ones who have eliminated the need for it. They've replaced it with a standard that doesn't change, a level of self-respect that doesn't allow excuses, and a system that runs regardless of internal noise. That's where real control comes from, not from waiting to feel ready, but from acting as if readiness is irrelevant. So stop chasing that feeling. Kill it. Replace it with standards. Replace it with structure. Replace it with a voice inside your head that doesn't care how you feel it, only cares what gets done. Because in the end, the men who win aren't the most motivated. They're the most controlled. And if you're still waiting to feel ready, then accept the truth. You're not built for dominance. But if you understand what I just said, if something inside you clicked, then good. Now there's no going back. No more excuses. No more waiting. You either become the man who acts without permission, or you stay exactly where you are. Your move